When I did my Rose Red deep dive back in April, I thought I was going to be able to read the Diary of Ellen Rimbauer in like a week. Take me like a week to like put the video together, maybe three if I procrastinated. Get part two out. Easy peasy. It is now October. It has taken me that long to get through that book because it is bad. It's bad. And not in like a fun, entertaining way, but in like a weird, boring, sort of racist way. Like, this book is the person that you avoid at extended family gatherings over the holidays. I don't know how long the runtime of this video is going to be, but snuggle up. We got a lot to talk about. None of it's good. If you haven't watched my recap of the 90s miniseries of Rose Red, you should do that, or better yet, watch the miniseries. This is going to provide a lot of context. For all of you lazy bastards who are not going to do that, here's a recap. Rose Red was a miniseries, 3 parts, in the 90s, about essentially the Winchester Mansion and the Haunting of Hill House mushed together. It was good. It's campy. I like it. The miniseries itself was written by Stephen King. Just the TV script. He has never written a book on this. However, the production company for the miniseries hired a ghostwriter to write the Diary of Ellen Rimbauer, which functions as a prologue. Ellen is, spoiler alert, one of the ghosts in the house. She's the lady of the house. A lot of this kind of revolves around her. Apparently it was a cult hit, bestseller. I guess there was nothing else better to read in 1991. I just want to take a second to reiterate how odd it is that Stephen King wrote the miniseries, but either he didn't want to or the production company couldn't afford to pay him to write the book. It's weird that they hired a ghostwriter when they literally had one of the most prolific authors, like right there. Like right there. He's in the miniseries. Like, I don't know why they made that choice. It was a bad choice. I'm not particularly a huge fan of Stephen King's writing, but I can only imagine it would have been better. Currently, the Diary of Ellen Rimbauer is published under the pseudonym of Joyce Reardon, who is the professor who takes everybody through the house. All of the, you've seen my recap. You know what's going on. Anyway, I thought that was like a cute little gimmick that the book is supposed to be like a true story, and Joyce is publishing it as like part of her research to like fundraise for this expedition that they're going on. I think that's like a fun bit of world building. The guy who actually wrote it is this guy. I've never personally read anything else by him, but you may know him from his Disney related stuff. He's done like a teen series that was set in the Disney parks. He's also done what was apparently a really popular Peter Pan prequel series that was also a Broadway musical. I will be roasting the shit out of his writing right now, but this was a long time ago, and I hope he's living his best life. So let's get into the book. I will be spoiling the shit out of this. You don't want to read this book anyway, so that's fine, but I will also be spoiling a bunch of stuff in the miniseries because they're basically identical. So if you haven't watched the miniseries, go fucking watch it. It's free on YouTube. It's a blast. Let's get into it. So I started out reading this book taking like detailed plot notes, and then I gave up because the plot does not differ or vary or have any additional color or depth that the miniseries doesn't also have. It's identical, and like I'm not mad that they followed the same script, but like I expected them to embellish a little bit, to like add something that I didn't already know, and the only thing that they've added aside from a couple of details is sex that they couldn't show on TV. I think I was just disappointed that they like because like we watched the miniseries, and I know you're supposed to read this before you like go see the miniseries, but like they couldn't have done anything interesting with this. Okay. The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer is set in early 1900s Seattle, focusing on Ellen, who is the wife of oil tycoon John Rimbauer. Ellen starts out just having met John. She is medium wealthy, and John is an oil tycoon and has a ridiculous, insane, billionaire level amount of money. We get to learn that she's like just started courting him, and she says that she likes him, and then provides us absolutely no evidence of a single positive quality about them. It feels very much like when you're talking to a friend who's like a couple months away from breaking up with their partner, and they're telling you about this person, and they're complaining about this person, and then they're like, oh yeah, well I guess like he'll propose probably, and like that'll be nice, and you're just sitting there with a glass of wine being like, you sure, babe? Sure, you yeah, real okay, great. She can't name a single thing that she actually likes about him other than the fact that he's not a virgin. Early on in the relationship, after they become a couple, but before they get engaged, Ellen hears rumors that John has been seen very frequently with some certain kinds of women at the docks. I'm going to read you a passage. Who is this man I hope to marry? I scarcely know. My fears have found their way into my prayers, and I find myself in sin, making silent requests to the powers that surround us to punish John Rimbauer, if any transgressions be known. Just last week, as I made such a dark prayer at the side of my bed, an enormous wind took wing and delivered not only a branch, but an entire tree to my window, shattering glass and throwing debris, as it was ripped from its roots. Oddly, no other tree in our yard was affected, nor did any neighbor report such wind. I attribute that reckoning to be the very substantial power of prayer, though my mother calls such reasoning foolish. Dear diary, let me tell you this. If that tree had anything whatsoever to do with my prayer, it had nothing to do with Christ. On that evening, neither Christ nor God were in my prayers. Oh, faint of heart, dare not read on, for it was to him I prayed, the other him, the other side. For if transgressions have been made, then John Rimbauer has already switched his alliance, whether aware of it or not. It is to his power that I pray. If you're praying to Satan to punish your hopeful fiance, maybe don't say yes to that proposal. So Rose Red is already under construction before they get married. Rose Red is not like a monument to his love of Ellen or anything. It's just the house that he's already started to build because he wants to fill it with a bunch of babies. We do see the foreman gets murdered, which we'll find out more details about later. Ellen is like a little like, oh, that's unfortunate. Weird about it. I would now like to read this passage from John to show just what a lovely romantic couple that they are. John, who is at least double the age of Ellen. Patience, my dear. Never push me. Never challenge my decisions. If you hold to these two virtues, we will never have a single quarrel, you and I. I am lord and master of my house. I have worked long and hard to earn not only a small fortune, but the right to stay on my own territory, and that territory includes opinion. You understand that, don't you, dearest? Despite John waving red flags like he's the king of the giant red flag parade, they get married for some reason. They then embark on their year-long honeymoon, which starts on a steamer ship as they go across the ocean. Apparently the sex is really good, but John doesn't really let her out of her cabin much and is super controlling. He's also already cheating on her in like the first week of their honeymoon. We're not surprised, we're just disappointed. Eventually, along their long and lustrous honeymoon, they make their way to Africa. There, John gives Ellen syphilis, probably. It's not like super confirmed, but it's probably syphilis. And Ellen gets super sick. It's at this point where Ellen meets Sakina, who is presumably a Kenyan maid. I'm not entirely sure where they were. Might have been Tanzania. Not clear. And Sakina nurses her back to health, and the two of them become besties. Sukina agrees to travel the rest of the way to Ellen and will eventually become her housemaid. At some point, they make their way to Egypt, and Sukina and Ellen are alone in a market in Cairo. I'd like to read you this passage. Her skin's so dark it shined blue. Nubian, they called out in their foreign tongue. And then I witnessed with my own eyes a side of Sukina that I had never before seen. She stared at this man, a glaring stare unlike anything, impossible to describe. She stepped towards him, her body fluid and flawless, moving more like a wave than a step, a snake than a legged creature. And all the while a deep, low, guttural sound pulsated from her throat and chest. The sound seemed to surround us. The man, increasingly uncomfortable with her approach, took a step back, the first sign she had dominion over him. At this point, the guttural sound evolved into language, a tongue I had never heard, not in all of our travels on the Dark Continent. But this man and his associate apparently understood the primitive message she imparted. As she waved her hands, the man stopped, absolutely still, as still as marble. That knife carried as an ornament, not a weapon. Both men began to tremble, and I swear I felt the earth beneath my feet rumbling like a self-contained earthquake. Then they folded in on themselves, and writhed in pain on the ground as if stricken by some disease to the stomach or bowels. Sukina took my hand, stepped around the one in front of us, and led me down the alley to our waiting driver. Sukina has not spoken of the incident, and I, for one, am glad of the fact, for I do not know what to say. I feel protected, defended against the dark side by my African friend. I am more intrigued by her unspeakable powers. Where such powers come from, and whether or not a person can learn them, can adopt them for her own, I have yet to learn. So, Ellen is magic because she prays to Satan. Sukina is magic because she's black, I guess. If while I was reading that description, you were like, oh fuck, this is bad. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. It only gets worse. So eventually, they come home. They start packing Rose Red full of all of this stuff that they found on their honeymoon. John does John things. And Ellen just grows increasingly resentful. There's a couple things that happen here that could be potentially triggering, so I'm not going to go into detail about them because they essentially don't influence the plot, but basically Ellen just gets more and more resentful of her husband, who she was already resentful of before they even got married. What a great marriage. We also, at this point, get to learn a little bit more about the house. Yes, that's it. Well, the poor man went insane. Totally mad. Sentenced to 25 years. He clawed his eyes out in his cell, claiming an Indian had made him do it. Said he came out of the hole like the devil, the hole being the foundation to this house, you see. Had handed him the shotgun. They uncovered Indian remains while digging the foundation. Goddamned cemetery is what it was. Skeletons by the wagon load, I heard. Some of the Chinamen quit. There was some illness blamed on the graves, fevers, that sort of thing. So yeah, they're using the Indian burial ground thing here, which is very, very briefly mentioned in the miniseries. It's not great that this is one of the very, very few things that Ridley Pearson decided he was going to expand upon. I get that they're trying to make the house seem like this malevolent force, like the land was cursed and it was always cursed, and this is why the house has so much power. However, since we've also added the fact that Ellen prays to the devil, and that she has this toxic marriage with burning resentment, I don't see why we need the house to also be on an Indian burial ground. The house could have started good, and then Ellen could have poisoned it through her toxic marriage and like all of her anger rising up in it. Like that works. That totally works. Later on, we get even more details about the Indian burial ground stuff. So, if I have to read this, you have to read it too. The souls of the departed Indians have no room for warriors. And men, according to Sukina, are all seen as warriors in the eyes of tribal leaders. Women, on the other hand, represent little threat, and few would dispute that a tribe's true history is known only by the women, for they survive much longer than the warriors. Sukina says Rose Red is not only punishing John and his mistresses by capturing the women to learn from them, to have them as company. I am not an expert on any of that, but I'm pretty sure that's not accurate. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I get that they wanted to explain why Rose Red kills men and just disappears its women. That's not a good explanation, though. It's not. I mean, it's a new twist on it, I guess. So, as that passage implied, we are starting to get some of the disappearances that we learned about in the miniseries. The first one is one of Ellen's friends has gone missing. She was invited over for tea and wandered off and never returned. It's later found out that she was probably fucking John, so the house ate her out of revenge, which, cool. That feels fine. I'm fine with that. Concerned about this, Ellen eventually goes to have a seance with Madame Lou, who is another magical POC, who tells her that basically the house is eating people and she's right to be terrified of it. This is nothing that we didn't know. One of the next disappearances is a maid who doesn't completely disappear but returns as a ghost. Both Sukina and Ellen have this moment of seeing her in the stables in a state of undress as a ghost trying to ask for help. Ellen is very shocked by seeing a naked woman for some reason. It is later found out that John, her husband, is R-wording a lot of the women here, and that was why that woman was killed. Ellen does fuck all about this, even though there's evidence that he's done this to so many women and that he is not going to stop. Eventually, the man who was helping John R-word some of these women is found trampled to death in the stables in a stall that didn't have a horse in it. Which just goes to show you, even ghosts believe that only poor people deserve to be punished for their crimes, while the rich just get to keep on doing it. So Ellen eventually has a baby boy who she names Adam. It's great. Everybody loves him. Adorable. Ellen then, a few years later, has her daughter April, who is born with an atrophied arm. For lack of a better word, it's not like specified what exactly she had. They use the term withered, which I don't think is appropriate. But essentially, it's the 1910s. John doesn't know what to do with a woman who's not perfect, because what use is a daughter if you can't marry her off easily? This birth is also very difficult, so at the end of it, Ellen can no longer have any more children. This basically severs any sexual relationship between John and Ellen because she doesn't need him to procreate anymore. She's given him his heirs. Now they can just be roommates. We also get this delightful little passage. I take my pleasure from motherhood. It suffices for me. It fills me as a man never could, as a man never will again. Because, once you're a mom and you let motherhood consume your entire identity and every waking thought and dream, you don't need sex anymore. You don't need any sort of physical pleasures whatsoever. You don't need anything except for your children. I can't tell if this is supposed to seem super unhinged or if it's supposed to just tell us how much Ellen loves her kids and how much she hates John. I can't tell if Ridley Pearson is aware of how bad that sounds. We're gonna assume that he intended for it to sound unhinged. At a certain point, Ellen again holds a seance, but this time, instead of going to Chinatown, she has it there in rose red. This is where she is told that as long as the house is continuing to be built, she will live forever. This, obviously, is what sparks the obsession with construction and constant building that we see later in the series. It's at this point that we get to see Douglas Posey's suicide. That's John Rimbauer's business partner. He commits suicide in front of the kids. The book expands on this by saying that John foisted Douglas out of the business by paying him off handsomely because he found out that Douglas was gay. Douglas then took the incredibly large payout that he got from this oil company that he owned and made bad investments and eventually was financially bankrupt. Somehow, that's John's fault. And that's why he, I could understand it more if John specifically bankrupted him, but Douglas, that's Dougie, boy, that's kind of your own thing. He was a very rich man. It's not like John screwed him over so that he couldn't provide for himself. It was oh no, do I have to sell one of my mansions? Oh, which of the 7 do I have to, hard to feel bad for that. And also, John was absolutely never going to out him because that would, like, make him look bad in 1910 Seattle society. So, like, I don't know, it just seems Ridley Pearson is trying to add more context to it, and it's just making it less compelling. I'm not saying that there's, like, ever a good reason for suicide, but, like, just expanding on it only made it seem weirder that Douglas did that in Rose Red instead of at home. It's like he's supposed to give us a reason that he did it specifically there, which, like, I think you could have just left it at, like, oh, Douglas was foisted out of the business and now he's mad and Rose Red had a grip on him. Like, that would have been sufficient, but he didn't really do that. He very much made it seem like it was Douglas's choice to do that he wasn't influenced by the house. So I don't know. It's just think it wasn't handled super well. Obviously, the kids are both traumatized. April doesn't talk for a while, but eventually magically starts talking again because she talks to Madame Lou. And then she goes missing. Around this time, we start to get hints that Ellen and Sakina are sleeping together. It doesn't fully come out until after April's disappearance, when Sakina first has another magical moment and gets a cop eaten by roses. It's not entirely clear. And then eventually is taken in for questioning and tortured by the police when she's the only witness to April's disappearance. It's at this point where things get a little fucked up. So John makes a deal with Ellen that he will make sure that Sakina gets out of police custody and that she isn't charged with April's disappearance if he can watch Ellen and Sakina going at it. Ellen has no choice but to agree, and she spends a couple of weeks nursing Sakina back to health. We get a little author's note here. Let me read it to you. In point of fact, Ellen Rimbauer apparently became obsessed with recounting her nearly nightly bedroom activities over the next several months, writing almost exclusively about her husband's increased addiction to these events and the elaborate acts he conceived for both his wife and his wife's best friend and servant. There are virtually no entries other than these, often repugnant and degrading, until early in 1918. An editorial time jump I readily make in order to spare you, the reader, the sordid descriptions of the debauchery to which John Rimbauer stooped. I don't understand why this was necessary. It feels like it's meant to be titillating and be like, ooh, these are some details that we couldn't put on TV. But, like, we already hated John. We already knew that there was a strong bond between Ellen and Sakina. And, like, it's not like they can't hook up, but, like, there's other problems with that. It feels unnecessarily sordid. And I just can't imagine a woman writing this. I can't imagine if a lesbian had written, like, it feels very much like this is happening as a plot point because Ridley Pearson is an old white man. Maybe it makes total sense to you. Maybe it really adds to the atmosphere for you, but for me it was just, what? No, this is about a haunted house, dude. What? No. Okay, so after all of that, Ellen eventually becomes obsessed with building a tower, which the house tells her will bring April back. Ellen builds it in secret with her own two hands, using John's... he's constructed a bunch of secret passages, essentially, so he can spy on people fucking. He's a voyeur, that's his deal. But she uses those to kind of hide where she's going and what she's doing. Eventually, they build the tower. She gets to see April reflected through the stained glass and talk to her, which is creepy, but great. And eventually, she and Sakina come together with a plan to kill John. Sakina tries to seduce John because even though he's been watching them fuck for months, he's never actually slept with Sakina out of respect for Ellen. Okay. So she lures him up there and then they push him out the window that's meant to be like a symbol of April. We see this in the miniseries, so this is not a surprise. After John's death, Ellen tells their son, Adam, all about the ghosts and takes him up to the tower to meet April. How this is possible when John destroyed the April window and they needed the April window to talk to her, I don't know. The whole book ends with an author's note about how Ellen slowly lost her mind and then wandered off into the perspective hallway area of the house and never returned. The assumption is that because she was promised eternal life when the house was still being built, that she is somewhere in the house still, alive and watching. They also give us this little tidbit at the end. If you're like me, you're already typing that URL into the Wayback Machine. Way ahead of you. Welcome to Beaumont University. This is the university, the fake university, that Joyce Reardon works for, the one that's funding the expedition to Rose Red. Most of the links here do not work, only the links related to Rose Red and Joyce Reardon work. It seems to be mostly promotional material for the diary, not necessarily for Rose Red. I didn't see in the miniseries anywhere where they mention this. But it's fun. You get like extra photos and you can see excerpts of the diary. There's even this cute little mini game thing where you can kind of go through and get the first chapter. It's yeah. It's certainly a project of its time. I'm honestly surprised that it even works. I expected it to be broken, but they're doing their best here. I didn't get all the way through it because obviously I've read a bit. But yeah, you can't sign up to be a student. I did try. They won't take my email. And you also get links to some of these other old pages that are kind of cool. Just a blast from the past from my childhood. Okay, so that's that. There are three things that I kind of want to unpack here. One is the racism. Two is Ellen and John's toxic marriage. And three is the general lack of creepiness in this book. I was never scared, except for my mental health. Let's start with the racism, shall we? So the way that this book talks about Black people and the way that it deals more specifically with Ellen and Tsukina's relationship is weird and uncomfortable and gross. I don't like it. I get that Ellen is writing a diary and this is supposed to be from her perspective, and it makes sense that Ellen, a wealthy white woman in the 1900s, would be a little bit racist. That's to be expected, and I'm not necessarily conflating Ellen's ideas about race and gender with Ridley's. I know that those are two different things. Like this passage, for example. One of Tsukina's many wonderful attributes is her ability to remain calm and consistent. Regardless of generation, Africans are quite gifted in this regard, able to leave the past behind, an argument, disagreement, or other difficulty without the slightest timidity, as if it had never occurred. Like, that's pretty egregious, but it's also along the lines of what someone like her would have thought and said. She goes on later in the passage to talk about how Black people don't have as much upward social mobility after the Civil War. So she's trying to be an ally, but not quite getting there. She's trying. But that seems very clearly to be Ellen's point of view and not necessarily Ridley Pearson's. What I have a problem with is that he is specifically using very fetishized, racially charged language when he describes Black people in a way that he did not need to. And he also doesn't do any sort of examination of how consensual Ellen and Tsukina's relationship is. There could have been scenes that he put in where it was more clear that Ellen was asking for consent or that Tsukina was consenting more. He doesn't examine this at all, which makes me think that he doesn't realize that it's something to be examined. Let's talk about the way that Ellen talks about Black people, specifically Black women. So this is during their honeymoon when they're on the steamer ship, and one of Ellen's maids is a young Black woman. "Truffles, madame?" A creamy, warm voice over my shoulder, as welcome as that tropical wind, a woman's voice, deep and soothing. I turned, perhaps too quickly for our proximity, and found myself eye to eye with a Negro of nut-brown skin and enormous olive-shaped eyes. Her face was a perfect oval, her lips thick and sensuous. I felt myself stir in a way no woman should stir for another woman. I'm certain I made a fool of myself, the way my voice caught, with the blush I may have revealed. "She couldn't have been over 15 if she's a day," Petite and fair-skinned, with black eyes and a strong back. Oh yes, I studied every inch of her as she worked. She saw me watching and seemed to take great pleasure in it. Giggling, provocative. She knows not what she does to me. I can't believe I'm going to say this. Putting aside the fact that that's a child. That's a child. She's just ogling, and she knows that's a child that she's ogling. A child who works for her. Ellen never describes any of her other maids like this except for Zucchina. She never has any sort of feelings for any of her white maids, any of her friends, no white woman whatsoever. She only talks this way about black girls and women. The author never addresses this in a way that makes it seem like he's aware of this. Like, there could have been, like, all you'd have to do was make her creepy to everyone, and then it's less specifically creepy and more that she's just a perv, which I can't, that would be better somehow. But she has a specific fetish for black women in a way that's not cool. It's specifically black women who work for her. That's, yeah. This is also how she describes Zucchina. Zucchina is always compared to an animal. Always. When we talk about her body and the way that she moves. In a way that nobody else is compared to. She stepped towards him, her body fluid and flawless, moving more like a wave than a step, a snake than a legged creature. And all the while, a deep, low guttural sound pulsated from her throat and chest. I can just imagine her lilting tone, the shifting from one broad hip to the other, the way she does. When Zucchina moves, it's like a cheetah. John has always been slightly afraid of big cats. Zucchina only ever gets like 5 or 6 full sentences in this entire book, despite the fact that apparently Ellen and Zucchina spend all of their time together, and they're madly in love, and she plays such an active role in the book, yet says so little, and we know so little about her, other than the fact that she's a magical black woman. I couldn't tell you anything about her. I couldn't tell you what her skills are. I can't tell you where she's from. I can't tell you what she likes or doesn't like. We get nothing. We should also talk about how consensual Ellen and Zucchina's relationship is. We already know that there's a power dynamic with her being Zucchina's boss. That's already icky. But then when you add the fact that she's several thousand miles away from home in a completely different continent, and also she's black in predominantly white Seattle, and we don't even know how much she's getting paid, if she's getting paid a living wage, if she could afford to go home if she wanted to, if she could afford to try and get a house and get a job, and like if anyone would hire her. It's unclear how much choice she actually has in this matter, and we never see her like actively pursuing Ellen or being given other choices. It seems like she might just be stuck in this house fucking her boss because she kind of has to, and that's just gross. It feels like Ridley Pearson doesn't recognize that that's a problem because he never addresses any of the consent. There's never like a scene where Ellen tries to get Zucchina to leave this evil house and Zucchina's like, no, I love you. There's none of that. There's no trying to mitigate that issue, which makes me think that he doesn't realize that it's an issue, which is not great. So yeah, there's some racism perhaps to be expected, but the way that a lot of it is just kind of brushed under the rug and not dealt with and not acknowledged makes me think that Ridley Pearson does not recognize that these are issues, which is yucky. Let's move on, shall we? Oh, and I didn't even mention the Indian burial ground shit. Let's not even, no. So John Rimbauer is an asshole rich guy in his 40s who's looking to settle down and find a nice little broodmare so that he can have some legitimate heirs amongst all of the other ones that he has sown. He will fuck anything with a pulse. He is ruthless in business and in pleasure. He doesn't believe that anyone should be allowed to have opinions, particularly people dating him, as we saw in that earlier quote. We don't get a single positive thing about him other than the fact that Ellen says he's sexually experienced, which, girl, that doesn't mean he's good. It just means he's done it a lot. But we see Ellen, because Ellen has to report all of this back to us in the diary, we see that Ellen knows this. Ellen knows that he's a bad guy. Ellen is a medium wealthy woman, at least in the same circles as an oil tycoon, which, like, means she's doing okay. She's reasonably pretty. She has other options. We don't see any of those other options, but it seems like she would have other options than to just marry him. She's not being forced into this. We don't get the sense that, like, her family is pressuring her, other than the fact that they think he's a good match because he is enormously wealthy. So, like, the fact that she enters into this willingly, knowing that he's a cheating dickface, and is like, oh no, he's a cheating dickface. It's hard to feel sympathy for her. You knew that. You knew, and you still did it. Look, I know that nice women with other options fall for bad guys all the time. Trust me, I know. But the fact that the author doesn't try to get us to fall in love with John in the way that Ellen is presumably falling in love with John just screams of bad writing. It's a much better reveal if we only get hints of his flaws, but we also see John being super charismatic and, like, sweeping her off her feet and, like, promising all of these sexual favors and, like, doing all of the right things. And then we find out, oh shit, she's married this total dick. She was blinded by love, because especially when it's a diary, you have the power to kind of be an unreliable narrator in that sense of showing us how in love she is with him and then not immediately showing his flaws. But because all Ellen does is complain about him the whole time, we're like, yeah, obviously this isn't gonna work. What did you think was gonna happen? The third complaint that I have, which is not nearly as big of a deal as the other two complaints, is that this book just isn't creepy. I get that it's been a while and, like, the miniseries now is pretty campy, but, like, that shit terrified me when I was a kid, when I saw it in the 2000s. Terrified me. This book just isn't scary. There's no sense of atmosphere in this big house. There's no sense of, like, looming dread, particularly since nothing creepy happens that we don't already pretty much get in the miniseries. So, like, anybody reading after watching the miniseries is not going to be surprised, and fear needs an element of surprise. Someone on a Goodreads review mentioned that it's difficult to create a scary atmosphere and a sense of creeping dread in a diary just because people don't normally, like, go on long visual descriptions in their diaries, when that's something that horror writers often rely on to build tension. And, like, I get that. I get that in a lot of ways the diary is technically more difficult to create that atmosphere, but I definitely also think that there's ways that Ridley Pearson could have amped up the creep. Like, for example, we're told Ellen is losing her mind. We don't see any evidence of this. Her diary is largely very coherent and sensible and fact-based, and we don't ever see, I don't know, like, her writing the same sentence over and over, or her saying that other people are not seeing what she's seeing, or, I don't know, we just don't get a sense that she is actually losing it a little bit, which I think could contribute to a sense of dread. We also could have the ability to pick up on things that Ellen isn't picking up on if she includes details in her diary. Like, it could be like a recurring symbol or a smell or something that we see a couple of times and we're like, oh, that's a bad sign. But Ellen not recognizing it as a bad sign, she's just reporting things. That could be a great way of building tension. And I also get that, like, Ridley Pearson was probably under a very tight time crunch to turn this around because they had to get the book out before the movie. I get that. So, like, it was never gonna be top tier quality. I just feel like he could have done a little bit better, you know? So yeah, that's The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer. Please don't read it. Very much an I read this so you don't have to kind of vibe. Do go watch the miniseries though. If you like this video and you would like to see more of these kinds of videos, please like and subscribe and hit the bell and kiss your screen for good luck and do a little nighttime bloodletting ritual to the algorithm gods to put this video into their favor. It means a lot, especially the last one. I will see you next time. Bye.